because this is a choice that Faure makes with the text and with the music, I'd like to use that as a segue to the next material, which is actually going to go back in time now to Franz Schubert, so the 18 teens now, whereas the Faure Requiem was 1880s, I believe, 1890s, and so uh, this is going to be a song, meaning voice and piano, and this is the text. And the text, even though it's sung by one person, the one singer, they they encompass both parts, the maiden and death. And so this is the first of the personifications of death. And we hear how Schubert personifies the text and gives death a specific character. And so the maiden, we hear the anxiety in her voice, and in the music we hear the fear, and then death becomes quite comforting and quite calming, and welcomes the maiden rather than it being adversarial in any way. And so this is the first of the personifications of death.
Vorüber, ach vorüber, geh wilder Knochenmann, ich bin noch jung, geh lieber und rühre mich nicht an, und rühre mich nicht an.
So in this, we can hear the change in the voice very quickly. We hear how the piano writing goes from being agitated to very serene. And so the text is set in a way that really drives home this feeling of comfort and um, of almost of love on the part of death taking the maiden. And this is, of course, a beautiful text and a beautiful song, but it's also interesting because this same text or the same tune, the exact same music, Schubert would later use in his life. In 1824, Schubert had a long stay in the hospital where he was informed that he wasn't going to live for more than 4 or 5 more years, and so he had to come to terms very quickly with his own mortality, and he wrote a string quartet that in the second movement, and he only wrote 2 movements of that quartet. The second movement is this melody, and is it the same music but written now for string quartet, so violin, viola, and cello, two violins, I should say. And so, in a way, it was Schubert. It became Schubert comforting himself later in his life as he comes to terms with the fact that he was going to die relatively soon at an extremely young age as well. And now for a different take on death. Here is jumping ahead another 50 years or so. This is Modest Mussorgsky's. This is the second of his songs and dances of death. This is a serenade that Death is now singing to his victim, but here's Death is presented as being seductive and as being charming almost, and so we see this other angle of Death, one that's much less foreboding, and we see Death as almost like a knight errant, something like that, and it's framed as such too, and we hear it in the melody as well. So in the music, whereas before you have this almost church-like stillness when Death is singing, but here the melody is much more florid and has a lot more shape to it, and so it sounds like a love serenade, but we understand that this is being sung by Death to his victim. So I'm going to start this in the middle, and we'll go to the end, and this is going to begin where it says, "The radiant blue of your eager eyes." So a different take. Here Death is seductive, and is almost slick, and so it's a quite different view of Death in this case. But still, we hear how at the ending there's almost frustration. It's very it's conflicting in many ways, but it's a different way of viewing Death. So after this, now we have, this is going to be an orchestral work. So this is Camille Saint-Saëns, a work called Danse macabre, and the Danse macabre, the dance of the dead, or the dance of the living among the dead, I should say, is a long trope that began in the 1400s. This idea of the memento mori, that death is never that far away. But it's used here in a much more grotesque way uh, than necessarily it's been seen in visual art. Uh, in the what we call the Romantic period, both in literature and in music, there is this emphasis on the supernatural and the macabre and grotesqueries, where there's it's almost you think of like Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, and the interest in the darkness of his writing that's over the top and uh, is is always macabre, but there's a very black humor involved as well. And in music, we see this very frequently throughout the Romantic period, generally the latter half of the 1800s. But one of the earliest instances of romantic uh, grotesquerie would be in Hector Berlioz wrote a work called Symphonie Fantastique, where in the fourth movement, the main character, and because there's a program, we track the course of a main character in a number of different environments, and in the fourth movement, he is beheaded by a guillotine, and we actually get to hear his head fall a couple stairs down below the guillotine using the cellos. And instead of that being the end of the work, that instead bridges into a very twisted dark fantasy in the fifth movement, the last movement, in which the main character, even though he's dead, awakes to find himself observing a black Sabbath with where a number of witches begin to dance and they raise the dead. He sees his beloved is raised from the dead, and she's disfigured and it's horrible. But that's one of the first instances of this macabre interest in death and turning it into something almost humorous. And so we hear some of that in this, the Danse Macabre by Saint-Saëns, where it's very programmatic as well. At the very beginning, we hear the clock strike midnight, and then the devil himself plays his violin in order to raise the dead, and we hear how discordant his violin is. And at some point, we're going to hear the xylophone, which sounds like bones as the skeletons dance around the graveyard. So this is Camille Saint-Saëns, Danse Macabre. Right. So we hear the bones dancing around, and it's almost fun in its own way. Um, so that's a different take. The black humor involved in Danse Macabre.